Hi, I'm Alex, and I saw with my own eyes a millionaire tycoon laugh at my 9-year-old brother when the engine of his priceless Ferrari sputtered and died just minutes before the biggest race of his life. Little did he know, his entire legacy, all his pride and all his money, depended on the quiet little boy he'd just dismissed. It was a moment that burned itself into my memory, the sheer arrogance of it all. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you knew you held the one answer everyone was desperately looking for? Before I tell you how my brother Leo used nothing but his own 2 hands to fix that legendary engine, drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you don't want to miss the look on that owner's face when that V12 finally roared. The air in the paddock that day was so thick you could taste it, a cocktail of high-octane fuel, burnt rubber, and pure, uncut anxiety. We were at a vintage Grand Prix, AI, playground for men with egos as big as their bank accounts, and at the center of it all was the disaster. A stunning 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, worth more than our entire town, sitting completely silent. Its owner, a famous tycoon named Mr. Sterling, was pacing beside it, his face turning a shade of red that clashed horribly with the car's brilliant paint. His rivals were gathered nearby, not even hiding their smirks. The final race of the championship was about to start, and his multi-million-dollar masterpiece was just an expensive, immobile sculpture of public failure. It was brutal to watch. My little brother Leo was standing beside me, almost blending into the background. He was 9, small for his age, with a permanent smudge of grease on his cheek. Our dad worked maintenance at the track, so we grew up with the sounds of engines as our lullaby. But Leo was different. He didn't just hear them, he listened to them. It was like he could feel their rhythm, their breath, their pain. He'd spend hours in our garage taking apart old lawnmower engines and reassembling them from memory, his small hands moving with a certainty that defied his age. To everyone else in that paddock, he was just some dusty kid who'd wandered where he didn't belong, another obstacle in the way of the important men in their clean, branded uniforms. Those important men were swarming the Ferrari like panicked ants. The head of the swarm was Marco, a chief engineer flown in from Maranello, a man who walked and talked like he'd personally invented the internal combustion engine. He and his team were tearing their hair out, barking orders, and running every diagnostic imaginable. They'd swapped the spark plugs, recalibrated the 6 massive carburetors, and hooked up laptops that probably cost more than our house. With every failed attempt, Marco's face grew darker, his professional pride crumbling in front of a live audience of his wealthiest clients. They had all the technology, all the credentials, all the experience, yet they declared the problem a complete mystery that couldn't possibly be solved in time. The car wasn't completely dead, which was somehow worse. Mr. Sterling would get in, turn the key, and the legendary V12 engine would cough to life. But the moment he touched the accelerator, trying to draw out the power needed for the race, it would choke. It was a pathetic, sputtering gasp, a sound of strangulation that made everyone wince. This car was everything to him, the crown jewel of a world-famous collection. Winning this race wasn't about the trophy. It was about beating a lifelong rival who was now publicly enjoying his humiliation. The clock was ticking down, each second amplifying the sense of absolute, crushing despair. The greatest car in the world was being defeated by a ghost in its own machine. Leo had been watching this whole circus from a safe distance, his head tilted, his expression intensely focused. He wasn't looking at the frantic engineers or the fancy laptops. He was just listening. After a few minutes of this, he took a hesitant step forward, trying to get closer. He tugged on the sleeve of a junior mechanic, a young guy who looked just as lost as everyone else. "It's not breathing right," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "It's choking." The chief engineer, Marco, overheard him and let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Get this kid out of here," he snapped, not even bothering to look at him. "We don't have time for fantasies." He waved his hand dismissively, shooing my brother away like a fly. I felt a hot surge of anger rise in my chest, so sharp it almost made me dizzy. I wanted to step in, to say something, to defend my little brother from that man's casual cruelty, but I was frozen. What could I, a teenager, say to a world-renowned engineer surrounded by millionaires? My voice would have been just another meaningless sound in the cacophony of panic. I just stood there, clenching my fists in my pockets, watching Marco turn back to the car with a smug look, as if he'd just swatted a particularly annoying insect. Some of the other mechanics chuckled under their breath, sharing in their boss's arrogance. In that single moment, Leo wasn't just ignored. He was erased, made into a joke for their entertainment, and my silence felt like a betrayal. Mr. Sterling, the owner, was so lost in his own storm of fury and embarrassment that he didn't even seem to notice the exchange. He was pacing back and forth, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the asphalt, his face a mask of primal rage. He was on his phone, shouting at someone, an agent, a manager, maybe God himself, about the millions of dollars in sponsorship and prestige that were evaporating with every passing second. To him, we weren't even there. We were part of the scenery, as insignificant as the discarded rags and empty water bottles littering the ground. His world was collapsing, and the idea that a small, dusty boy could possibly hold the key was so far beyond his reality that it simply didn't exist. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own importance. I looked over at Leo, expecting to see tears welling up in his eyes, but there was no crying. There wasn't even anger. He just took a small step back, his shoulders slumping slightly, and a look of profound disappointment crossed his face. It was a look I knew well. It wasn't the look of someone whose feelings were hurt. It was the look of a craftsman, seeing a beautiful thing being mistreated by people who didn't understand it. He was sad for the car. He was frustrated that these supposed experts were so deaf to what the engine was clearly telling him. He just quietly retreated from the circle of chaos, his small form swallowed by the shadows of the massive equipment trucks, and my heart ached for him. "Let's go, Leo," I whispered, putting a hand on his shoulder. "These guys are jerks. It's not worth it." But he just shook his head, his eyes never leaving the stricken Ferrari. He spotted an old overturned tire crate a few yards away, partially hidden behind a stack of fuel barrels. He walked over to it, sat down, and pulled his knees up to his chest, making himself as small as possible. From this new vantage point, he was out of the way, invisible to the frantic team, but he had a perfect, unobstructed view of the engine bay. He wasn't pouting or sulking. He was observing, processing, listening with an intensity that was almost unnerving. He was refusing to abandon the patient, even after the doctors had thrown him out of the operating room. The desperation around the car was escalating into pure chaos. In their haste, the engineers were becoming clumsy. I saw one of them drop a heavy wrench, which clattered loudly against the pristine fender, leaving a tiny but noticeable chip. Mr. Sterling let out a cry of anguish, as if he'd been physically struck. Marco, ignoring the damage, barked an order to try starting it. Again. This time, when the engine sputtered, it let out a deafening backfire, a gunshot-like explosion that sent a plume of black smoke into the air. The smell of raw, unburnt gasoline was suddenly overpowering, a sickly sweet perfume of failure. It was clear to everyone, even me, that they were no longer fixing the problem. They were just making it worse, blindly attacking the symptoms while the disease festered. I was suddenly reminded of our grandfather. He wasn't a car mechanic. He was a watchmaker, a man who worked in a world of millimeters and silence. He used to let us sit in his dusty little shop, and he once told us, while holding a tiny, intricate gear with a pair of tweezers, "Most people only look at the big, shiny parts. They forget that a machine is a conversation. If you don't listen to the quietest whisper, you'll never understand why it's screaming." He taught Leo how to listen, not just with his ears, but with his fingertips, to feel the subtle vibrations that tell the real story. I looked from the chaotic, shouting engineers back to my brother, sitting silently on his crate, and I understood. They were all screaming, and he was the only one listening. The final hammer blow of humiliation was about to fall. A man in a crisp official's polo shirt approached Mr. Sterling, holding a clipboard. His expression was one of polite, professional regret. He spoke in a low voice, but we could all guess the words. "Time was up. You have to forfeit." Just then, Mr. Sterling's chief rival, a man with a smug, predatory grin, walked past. He didn't say a word. He just slowed his pace, caught Mr. Sterling's eye, and gave him a slow, pitying nod. It was a perfectly executed act of psychological warfare. Defeated, Mr. Sterling slumped against the side of his beautiful, silent car, his face pale, his shoulders sagging. He had lost. The experts had failed. His pride was in tatters, and the race was over before it had even begun. It was in that heavy, suffocating silence of total failure that something shifted. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a funereal stillness. The crowd of onlookers started to murmur and drift away, the spectacle of disaster now concluded. Mr. Sterling looked like a statue of a defeated king, his hands limp at his sides, his gaze fixed on nothing. All the power, all the money, all the influence in the world had been rendered useless by a ghost in his machine. I saw his shoulders heave in a single, silent sob of pure frustration. He had poured his soul into this car, into this race, and in front of everyone who mattered he had been brought to his knees. His world had shrunk to the size of that silent engine bay. That's when Leo moved. He didn't run or shout. He just slipped off his tire crate and walked quietly toward the car, moving with a purpose that was completely at odds with the defeated atmosphere. The circle of mechanics had broken apart, most of them now packing up their tools with sullen, downcast faces. Leo didn't approach the furious Marco or the broken Mr. Sterling. Instead, he walked right up to that same junior mechanic, the one who looked barely out of his teens, and tugged on his sleeve again. "Please," Leo said, his voice soft but clear in the sudden quiet. "It's choking. It's getting too much air when the engine asks for more gas. That's why it coughs." Marco, who was stuffing a laptop into a case with violent, jerky movements, overheard him. He spun around, his face contorted with rage. "I told you to get that boy out of here," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Leo. His voice echoed across the paddock, raw and unprofessional. "The race is forfeited. It's over. We have failed. Are you happy now? Does your little fantasy make you feel important? Get out. All of you, just get out of my sight." He wasn't just yelling at Leo. He was yelling at the universe, at his own failure, and my small brother was just the most convenient target for the shrapnel of his imploding ego. I saw the junior mechanic flinch, taking a step away from Leo. The outburst, however, had an unintended effect. It pierced the fog of Mr. Sterling's despair. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes bleary, and for the first time, he truly saw my brother. He didn't see a dusty kid. He saw the focal point of his chief engineer's meltdown. His gaze shifted from Marco's furious face to Leo's calm, determined one. Leo's words, maybe repeated by the now frightened junior mechanic or just hanging in the air after the shouting stopped, seemed to land in his mind. Choking on too much air. It wasn't technical jargon. It wasn't a complex diagnostic. It was simple, almost childishly so, but it was also a tangible idea, a physical description of what he'd heard the engine do. A different kind of explanation. Mr. Sterling pushed himself off the car, standing up to his full height. He was still pale, but a new light had entered his eyes. It wasn't hope. It was the cold, calculating look of a gambler with one last chip to play. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. He wasn't talking to Marco. He was looking directly at Leo. Before Leo could answer, Sterling waved a dismissive hand at his entire team. "Everybody, back away from the car now!" Marco started to protest. "Sir, this is ridiculous. We can't—" But Sterling cut him off with a look so sharp it could have cut steel. "What's the harm now, Marco? Can it get any more broken? Let the boy look." A wave of stunned silence rippled through the remaining crowd. People who had been walking away now stopped and turned back. Their curiosity piqued. This was a new kind of drama. The world-renowned engineering team from Maranello was being ordered to stand down for a 9-year-old kid in a dirty t-shirt. I saw Marco's face go from red to a sickly white. He was being publicly overruled, his authority completely dismantled by a desperate whim. The other mechanics just stood there, frozen, their faces a mixture of disbelief and open mockery. They weren't just watching a boy look at an engine, they were watching the complete and utter humiliation of their boss. The tension in the air became electric. Leo didn't seem to notice the dozens of eyes now fixed on him. He didn't seem to care about the silenced engineers or the stunned millionaire. He just walked calmly to the front of the Ferrari, stood on his tiptoes to peer into the engine bay, and took a deep breath. He looked at the 6 dual-throat carburetors, the maze of fuel lines, the polished valve covers, but he didn't touch anything. Instead, he did exactly what our grandfather had taught him. He reached out and gently placed his small, bare hand on the cast aluminum intake manifold, right in the center of the V12. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was shutting out the world, shutting out the noise, and just listening to the machine. For a full minute, nobody moved. The only sound was the distant hum of a generator and the frantic thumping of my own heart. Leo just stood there, his small hand resting on the engine as if he were calming a nervous animal. The air was thick with skepticism. I could see the smirks on the faces of Marco's team, the pitying looks from the onlookers. They were all waiting for the punchline, for this absurd little scene to end, so they could go back to the real world. But Mr. Sterling wasn't laughing. He was watching my brother with an unnerving intensity, his entire empire of pride and power hanging on the quiet wisdom of a 9-year-old boy. I felt a surge of protective fear, wanting to pull Leo away before this whole thing backfired and crushed him. Finally, Leo opened his eyes and took his hand off the manifold. He didn't look triumphant or excited. He looked serious, like a doctor who had just finished a difficult diagnosis. He turned, not to Mr. Sterling or the fuming Marco, but to the young junior mechanic who had been caught in the middle of it all. "It's the air," Leo said, his voice soft but clear. "When the engine asks for more fuel, it gets a gulp of wrong air from somewhere else. It's a tiny sound, like a hiss, a leak." He pointed to a spot buried deep in the engine, near the base of the central carburetors, a place almost completely obscured by a polished metal heat shield. "The sound is wrong. Right there. It's hiding." Marco couldn't contain himself any longer. He lunged forward, his face a mask of professional fury. "This is a circus. An absolute farce," he spat, his voice trembling with indignation. "He's pointing at a brand new intake gasket. I supervised the installation myself this morning. It is perfect. There is no leak." He turned his appeal to Mr. Sterling, trying to drag him back to the world of logic and credentials. "Sir, you are being played by a child's fantasy. We are wasting the last seconds we have on a ghost story. Let my team work, or let's pack up with what little dignity we have left." He was pleading, but it was a plea to save his own pride, not the car. His expertise was being challenged by a whisper, and he couldn't stand it. Mr. Sterling's eyes darted from Marco's apoplectic face to Leo's unwavering calm. For a moment, I saw him hesitate. Everything in his life, every success, had been built on listening to experts like Marco. But the experts had failed him. He glanced across the paddock at his rival, who was now watching the scene with undisguised amusement. The decision was made in that instant. "Dignity is a luxury I no longer have, Marco," Sterling said, his voice dangerously quiet. He locked eyes with the junior mechanic. "You, get a wrench. I want that heat shield off, now." It wasn't a request. It was the final desperate command of a king betting his entire kingdom on a single impossible roll of the dice. Marco looked like he'd been slapped. The young mechanic was caught in the crossfire, his face pale with anxiety. He looked at Marco, who glared at him with a look that promised professional ruin, then at Mr. Sterling, whose gaze was unyielding. With hands that visibly shook, he selected a small socket wrench from the cart. The crowd, which had started to disperse, now surged back in, a silent, curious wave. The only sound in the entire paddock was the soft, rhythmic click-click-click of the wrench as the mechanic slowly loosened the bolts. Each click echoed the pounding in my chest. I was terrified. If Leo was wrong, the humiliation would be swift and brutal. He'd be a laughingstock, the crazy kid who thought he could fix a Ferrari, and I would be the brother who just stood by and let it happen. As the heat shield was carefully lifted away, it revealed the gasket sealing the base of the carburetors to the manifold. It looked pristine, a brand new, perfectly cut piece of high-performance material. "See?" Marco barked, a note of triumphant relief in his voice. "It is perfect. There is nothing wrong." But Leo, who had moved closer, didn't flinch. He leaned in, his small finger pointing to one specific spot. "There," he whispered. "It's not torn. It's pinched." Everyone leaned in to look. And then we saw it. A tiny, almost invisible imperfection. A minuscule fold along the inner ring of the gasket. A crease no thicker than a piece of paper, created when a bolt was likely over-tightened during installation. It was a flaw you would never see unless you were looking for it with almost superhuman focus. "When the engine is just idling, the pressure is low and it stays sealed," Leo explained, his voice gaining confidence as he described what he knew to be true. "But when you press the gas, the engine creates a powerful vacuum. It sucks that little fold open just enough to let in a tiny bit of air. It's not enough to stall it, but it's enough to lean out the fuel mixture and make the engine choke and sputter when it needs power the most. It was a diagnosis of such elegant simplicity that it silenced everyone. It wasn't about complex electronics. It was about a fundamental law of physics. It was a flaw no diagnostic computer could ever find, because it only existed under a specific dynamic load. A heavy silence fell over the group. Marco just stared, his mouth slightly open, the color draining from his face. He had been defeated not by another engineer, but by a 9-year-old's sense of hearing and a tiny folded piece of paper-thin material. Mr. Sterling looked at the minuscule flaw, then at Leo, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had his answer. "We don't have a replacement gasket," Marco stammered, his voice barely a whisper. It was a final, pathetic attempt to find an obstacle. Mr. Sterling didn't even look at him. "We won't need one," he said, his voice now filled with a cold, renewed purpose. He turned to the junior mechanic. "Get me a tube of high-temp RTV sealant, the fast-curing kind. We're closing that leak." The young mechanic, no longer hesitant, scrambled to a toolbox and returned with a tube of red sealant. Mr. Sterling took it from him, knelt beside the engine and looked at Leo. "Show me exactly where," he commanded. Leo reached out and with one small, greasy finger traced the line of the tiny crease. Without a word, Mr. Sterling carefully applied a thin, precise bead of the bright red sealant over the flawed section of the gasket. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it was a perfect field repair, designed to create a temporary airtight seal. He worked with a surgeon's focus, his earlier panic replaced by a chilling calm. He was no longer just the owner, he was now a participant in this desperate, last-ditch effort. The air was electric with anticipation. After applying the sealant, he replaced the heat shield, tightening the bolts himself with slow, deliberate turns. He didn't rush, he didn't speak, he just worked. When he was finished, he stood up, wiped his hands on a clean rag, and looked at his team. His gaze lingered on Marco for a long moment, a silent message passing between them that was more devastating than any shouted insult. Then he turned, walked to the driver's side door, and slid into the seat. He didn't look at the crowd or the clock. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the wooden steering wheel. The entire paddock was holding its breath with him. This was the moment of truth. Either the V12 would roar to life, or it would be the final, pathetic cough of a spectacular failure. Mr. Sterling turned the key. The starter motor whirred for a split second, a familiar sound that had preceded so much failure. The engine caught instantly, settling into a low, rumbling idle. But this was the test it had passed before. The real demon lived in the higher RPMs. I saw Mr. Sterling's knuckles turn white as he gripped the wheel. He glanced at the official, who was now looking at his watch with an expression of finality. The entire paddock was dead silent, a vacuum of anticipation. Every eye was on his foot, hovering over the accelerator pedal. This was it, the moment where a boy's whisper either became a legend or the punchline to a very expensive, very public joke. My own breath was trapped in my throat, a painful, sharp knot of hope and fear. He didn't stomp on the pedal. He pressed it slowly, deliberately, as if testing the waters of a treacherous river. The engine's rumble deepened, climbing the scale from a baritone hum to a rising tenor. 1,000 RPM, 2,000, 3,000. This was the point of failure, the invisible wall where the engine would always choke and gasp for air. I saw Leo lean forward, his eyes wide, not with anxiety, but with absolute certainty, as if he were merely waiting for the orchestra to play a note he had already composed in his head. Mr. Sterling's jaw was clenched, his entire body tensed for the inevitable, sickening sputter that had haunted him all afternoon. The world seemed to slow down, holding itself in that single agonizing moment of suspense. Then he pushed past it. 4,000 RPM, 5,006. There was no sputter. There was no choke. There was only a sound. It wasn't just a roar. It was a clean, crisp, earth-shattering symphony of 12 perfectly synchronized pistons. The sound exploded from the exhaust pipes, a ferocious, unrestrained scream of pure, unadulterated power that ripped through the silence and vibrated through the asphalt, right up into the soles of my shoes. It was the sound of a legend awakening from a nightmare. a sound that declared its own resurrection. It was so loud, so violent, so utterly perfect, that it felt like a physical blow. Mr. Sterling kept his foot down for a few seconds, letting the glorious noise wash over everyone, a sonic baptism of vindication that cleansed the air of all doubt. A wave of collective shock washed over the paddock. For a second, nobody moved. They just stared, their faces a canvas of disbelief. Then, a single person started clapping. Another joined in, and another, until the entire area erupted in a spontaneous, thunderous ovation. It wasn't just for the car. It was for the sheer impossibility of what they had just witnessed. The tension that had been strangling the air for hours finally broke, replaced by a buzzing electric energy. Men in expensive suits were shaking their heads, smiling in pure astonishment. The junior mechanic who had helped Leo looked like he was about to burst into tears of relief, a wide, incredulous grin spreading across his face. The impossible had just happened right in front of them. I glanced over at Mr. Sterling's rival. His smug, predatory grin had completely vanished, melted away and replaced by a slack-jawed look of utter bewilderment. He stood frozen, his celebratory champagne flute now looking absurd in his hand. He had been so close to his ultimate victory, a triumph built on his rival's public humiliation, and in the space of a few minutes it had all been snatched away from him, not by a team of rival engineers, but by the sound of a perfectly tuned V12 engine brought back from the dead by a little boy. His face was a mask of cold, hard disbelief. He wasn't just watching a car run, he was watching his victory speech turn to ash in his mouth. He slowly lowered his head and turned away, defeated by a miracle he couldn't comprehend. But my eyes were drawn to Marco. He hadn't moved. He was standing in the exact same spot, a statue of shattered pride. His face was ashen, completely, drained of blood. His mouth was slightly agape, and his eyes fixed on the Ferrari were wide with a horror that went beyond professional failure. This was an existential crisis. His entire world, built on a foundation of credentials, data, and hard-won expertise, had just been demolished by a child's intuition. He had been so certain, so arrogant, so dismissive, and now the sound of that engine was the sound of his own irrelevance echoing across the paddock. In that moment, he wasn't a chief engineer from Maranello. He was just a man who had been proven profoundly and publicly wrong in the most humiliating way imaginable. Mr. Sterling finally let his foot off the accelerator, and the engine settled back into a flawless, powerful idle. He didn't jump out of the car or pump his fist in the air. He just sat there for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, and closed his eyes. He took a deep, steadying breath, letting the reality of the situation sink in. Then, he opened his eyes and his gaze swept past the cheering crowd, past his stunned mechanics and past me. He looked directly at Leo. He didn't smile. He didn't even mouth, "Thank you." He just gave my brother a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a look that transcended gratitude. It was a look of profound, unshakable respect. A silent acknowledgement from one world to another. A king bowing to the quiet wisdom of a boy who could listen to whispers. The race official, looking as stunned as everyone, Hills gave a sharp nod. The Ferrari was cleared. The race was on. Mr. Sterling switched off the engine, got out of the car, and the world seemed to snap back into motion. But he didn't run to his team or bark orders. He moved with a calm, deliberate purpose, walking right past the shell-shocked Marco as if he were a ghost. He walked through the parting crowd of onlookers and mechanics and stopped directly in front of my brother. He knelt down, putting him at eye level with Leo, the massive, powerful tycoon and the small, dusty boy. He didn't smile. He just put a hand on Leo's shoulder and said, his voice low and firm, "You're not watching this from down here. You're coming with me." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. He led the two of us, me trailing behind like a dazed shadow, up the stairs to the glass-walled VIP box high above the track. The atmosphere inside was one of hushed luxury, and heads turned as we entered. This powerful man with two grimy kids in tow ignored them all, leading us to the prime spot overlooking the start-finish line. Leo didn't even notice the plush chairs or the table laden with food he'd only ever dreamed of. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide, fixed on the red Ferrari as it took its place on the grid. When the green flag dropped, the sound of that V12, now part of a symphony of roaring engines, was different. It was our sound. We watched as the GTO didn't just compete, it dominated, pulling away from the pack with a ferocious grace, a perfect, relentless machine. The victory was never in doubt. Lap after lap, Mr. Sterling extended his lead, driving with a renewed, almost spiritual confidence. When he crossed the finish line, the crowd erupted, but the real story was unfolding away from the track. Down in the paddock, I caught a glimpse of Marco. He wasn't celebrating. He was standing alone by a tool cart, his shoulders slumped in defeat. No one spoke to him. No one even looked at him. He was invisible, an outcast in the very world he had commanded just an hour earlier. Later, as the champagne was being sprayed on the winner's podium, I saw him quietly loading his expensive cases into the back of a black sedan. He moved like a man in a trance, his face a blank mask of ruin. His career, built on a mountain of pride, had been leveled by a whisper. After the chaos of the podium celebration died down, Mr. Sterling found us. He led my dad, Leo, and me into a quiet, wood-paneled office, away from the noise. He sat down, not behind a big desk, but in a chair opposite us. He looked at my dad, but he spoke to my brother. "I owe you more than a race, Leo," he said, his voice filled with a genuine gravity I never thought a man like him could possess. He explained that he was setting up a trust fund for Leo's education. "Any school, any engineering program in the world, it's yours." Then he leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "But I have a better offer. My private restoration workshop. It's filled with the greatest cars ever made. I want you there. I want you to learn from my master craftsmen. I want you to teach them how to listen." I watched my brother's face. The mention of a trust fund, of money, had barely registered. But when Mr. Sterling spoke of the workshop, the engines, the machines, a light came on in Leo's eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the look of someone who had just been handed the keys to the only kingdom he had ever wanted. He just nodded, a small, shy smile finally breaking through his serious expression. My dad stood beside me, silent, his hand on my shoulder, and I could feel him trembling slightly. It wasn't about the money. It was about this moment of profound, unbelievable validation for his quiet, different son. It was the world finally catching up to what we already knew. Leo wasn't broken. He was brilliant. Later that evening, long after the crowds had gone home, Mr. Sterling gathered his remaining, humbled crew in the now silent garage. The gleaming Ferrari sat in the center, a trophy of a lesson hard learned. Leo was nearby, completely absorbed in a technical manual he'd found, tracing the diagrams with his finger. Mr. Sterling gestured toward him. "Look at him," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an epiphany. "Today, in a world of wealth, credentials, and arrogance, we were all reminded of a simple truth." He paused, letting his words sink in. "True genius doesn't come with a brand name or a fancy degree. It comes from a quiet place. It comes with a heart that knows how to listen." That day changed everything, and not just because of the money or the opportunities. It was deeper than that. Leo got his workshop, his paradise of engines and gears, and he blossomed there in a way school never could have allowed. He wasn't just the dusty kid from the maintenance crew anymore. He was Leo, the boy who could listen. But the real change was in the air around us. It was the end of that gnawing feeling that we were on the outside looking in. The invisible wall that separated our world from theirs had been shattered by the roar of that engine. For the first time, people didn't look past us. They looked at us. And in their eyes I saw not pity or dismissal, but a kind of wonder, a respect that had been earned not with money or status, but with a quiet, undeniable truth. We never saw Marco again after that day. A few months later, my dad heard some of the track veterans talking. Marco had been quietly let go from his prestigious position. There was no public scandal, no dramatic firing. He just vanished from the elite circles. His name, once a mark of ultimate expertise, became a quiet, cautionary tale whispered among mechanics. A story about how pride can make a man deaf to the one sound that matters most. I never felt happy about his downfall, just a profound sense of sadness. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man so trapped inside his own importance that he couldn't see the simple truth right in front of him. His arrogance had built a prison, and the sound of that Ferrari's engine was just the sound of the door locking behind him for good. The change in Mr. Sterling was perhaps the most surprising of all. He became a true mentor to Leo, not just a distant benefactor. I'd sometimes go with Dad to drop something off at the workshop and see them together, this giant of industry and my little brother, their heads bent over a blueprint or a rare engine block. Sterling wasn't just teaching, he was listening. He'd ask Leo questions, not like a teacher testing a student, but like a peer seeking a valued opinion. He had been humbled that day, stripped of his arrogance in front of the entire world, and it had somehow saved him. He learned that the most valuable assets in his life weren't the things he owned, but the rare, quiet wisdom he had almost dismissed. He found a different kind of wealth, one that didn't roar, but whispered. Looking back, I realized that story was never really about a car. It was about that feeling, the feeling of having the answer, of seeing the solution so clearly, while the so-called experts around you are shouting and running in circles, completely blind. It's the feeling of being invisible. I know some of you watching have felt that. Maybe in a boardroom meeting, a family argument, or a classroom. You have a quiet truth to offer, but the world is too loud, too arrogant, or too busy to listen. That day taught me that your voice doesn't have to be the loudest to be the most powerful. Sometimes, the most profound changes start with a whisper that no one else can hear but you. You just have to be brave enough to trust it, even when no one else does. If you know someone who feels underestimated, someone with a quiet talent that the world keeps overlooking, please share this story with them. Sometimes, seeing that it's possible is all the encouragement someone needs to finally trust their own voice. Remember that your unique perspective is your greatest strength, especially when it doesn't fit into the neat little boxes society creates. True genius rarely shouts for attention. Thank you so much for listening to my family's story. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about finding your own path and proving that true worth isn't about the noise you make, but about the genuine impact you have. Your voice matters, especially when you think no one is listening. That's often precisely when it's needed the most.